If Ska Studios' goal was to make a 2D Dark Souls, they certainly succeeded with Salt and Sanctuary, a punishing side-scrolling action game where you create a hero and make your way through a challenging world filled with darkness, overbearing enemies, and lots of death. While my time with Salt and Sanctuary reminded me of some Soulsian frustrations I'm not a huge fan of, it also shined a new light on the poise and elegance of the style that requires a mastery of mechanics to survive and progress. The world is brought to life in a distinctive hand-drawn style that is almost equally brutal and goofy, calling to mind the developers' past work on more arcade-like beat-em-ups like Charlie Murder. The tone is pitch black though, but little things like the cartoony look of the character faces bring tiny bits of levity to the forefront. That weird contrast helps make the overall brutality a little duller, but overall more palpable. And brutal this game is, as the side-scrolling battles require precision and deftness, accounting for the length your attack animations take while also keeping an eye on the enemy so you can time your parry or riposte and try not to be overwhelmed. It's a constant challenge, and the open level-less design makes it easy to stumble upon an enemy that's potentially out of your league. The overall layout is reminiscent of a Metroidvania, but for better or worse, it has no map. Thankfully, the flow is straightforward enough for this to not be a game-breaking issue, but the lack of guidance made me a little more cautious of going off and exploring what seemed to not be the main path. It is engrossing enough that getting lost is fun, but not so much when you get your head beaten by a difficult enemy and then you're not sure where to go next. Salt and Sanctuary is the kind of experience I might recommend poking around a guide to stave off frustration. Thankfully, since it debuted on other platforms 2 years ago, a lot of literature is out there. While discovery, to an extent, is a positive, thrilling aspect, the game throws you into the fray with very little explanation about what anything does. You're taken immediately to a character creation screen that gives you class options and more details, but nothing of consequence is explained about what anything does outside of any pre-existing knowledge you might have of what like a knight or a mage usually does in games. Some classes are definitely more friendly to rookies, but the only way to find that out is through experimentation or online assistance. I made multiple builds before settling on something that seemed like it could go deep in the game with less potential pain. Adding to that, too often it is hard to parse through the overflowing amount of information for equipment, items, and stats, for both that lack of explanation and the smaller, darker text that displays a little too tiny on your Switch screen. It's not as much of an issue docked, but it's a little problematic otherwise. Working through some of those issues is worthwhile, as Salt and Sanctuary is a deep, expansive adventure rife with challenge. The combat, while demanding, is deep enough to stay interesting, but not complicated enough to be too overwhelming. An emphasis on platforming also keeps exploration varied to boot. Death can be punishing, since an enemy steals your accrued salt, required for upgrades, and then you lose it all if you die again before defeating that foe. Thankfully, salt is relatively easy to grind for if you fail too often, and even a battered player can gain enough resources to become stronger. That all comes back around to how, at its core, Salt and Sanctuary is 2D Dark Souls. I say that not as any indictment, but more of a very adept comparison. Ska Studios smartly transformed the core concept of a Souls game and turned it into a side-scrolling action game with ample amount of Metroidvania influence. The result is tough as nails, but doable with perseverance and gumption. Salt and Sanctuary is not for the faint of heart, but it's a journey worth suffering through for those who think they might be worthy.